So, thank you for joining us today for this webinar titled Meeting Accreditation Standards for Learner Readiness and Integrity. My name is Dr. Mac Adkins. I'm the founder and chief academic officer with SmarterServices. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Doug Weimer, who's the CEO and lead consultant for Southeastern Accreditation Consultants. There we go. So first of all, I just want to thank you for being an educator. Obviously, Dr. Weimer and I are both educators, and we really appreciate and respect what you do as educators. And I wonder if you ever slow down and ask yourself why. Why am I an educator? Chances are you might could be making more money with something else, but there's something about this profession that drives you. And part of what drives me, and perhaps you too, is knowing that what we do as educators really makes a difference in the lives of students and also the lives of their families, even multi-generationally. You know, it's been proven that one of the best ways to break the cycle of poverty for an individual and then subsequently for their family is through continuing their education. So I just wanted to start out by thanking you here on this Wednesday afternoon. It may be a long week for you, but I just want to pump you up and let you know that what you do is important, makes a difference in the lives of your students and their families. So I also want to thank you for your time. We will hold this exactly to just 1 hour, but during this hour, we're going to be discussing some issues that relate to accreditation. We're going to be highlighting some relevant research. We're going to be exposing you to some external resources and also talking about 2 different tools that you may be able to use to foster learner integrity as well as learner readiness. Some of you on this webinar are currently SmarterServices clients. So for you, the information about the tool you're using may be redundant, but there are others for whom this may be new information. So Dr. Weimer and I didn't want to expose our ages, but both of us have been educators, we'll just say for multiple decades, right? I've been in it for longer than 3 decades. In fact, I got started in e-learning back before it was cool. I started doing distance learning in the mid-90s, about 1995. So that was before the internet was really a popular thing even. I was at a university that was doing videotape-based delivery of distance learning. So I've seen this thing for a long time. And over those 3 decades, there are 3 truths that have remained true regardless of where we are in the e-learning process, if it's in its infancy or in its maturity. But those 3 things are, first, that distance learning is a better fit for some people than it is for others, right? And that really is based on non-cognitive factors, traits, attributes, and skills, motivation, control over procrastination, willingness to ask for others. And being able to assess that provides insight to students about their degrees of readiness. That's just as true today as it was 30 years ago. Another thing that has remained true is that most students are willing to do as little as they can to get the course done. You know, higher education is one of those weird things that people are willing to pay a lot of money for, but then they're happy when they don't receive much of it. Have you ever thought about that? Think about that lecture class when the faculty member doesn't show up. Everybody's so happy when they get to leave the classroom early, even though they paid that expensive tuition. Same thing in online courses. If you have an online course that's not very rigorous, people are kind of happy about that. But you know what? Students, they want to do as little as they can and get through the course. And it's that mentality, I think, that's at the core of a lot of the academic integrity issues that we have, that students just want to do as little as they can to get by, so they don't put a lot of preparation into their test. And that's what can prompt some of the cheating and other things that's going on. You know, using ChatGPT to write your term papers, all those things is really from that attitude. So proctoring fosters integrity by monitoring students as they're demonstrating their level of mastery. And the third truth that's remained true is that, you know what? Students are not the only ones who want to do as little as possible and get by. I think that's also true of our organizations, of our schools, our colleges, our universities. We'd love to just get by with as little administrative burden as we can. That's why I did that little poll to kind of see what the thinking is about, how hard is that administrative burden. I was glad that everyone didn't vote there for it being a super, super strong burden. But you know what? Accreditation is what keeps us diligent. I see it as parallel to proctoring, keeping students honest. The accreditation process keeps organizations diligent as well. So this webinar today really is at the nexus of those three truths about students, that online learning is a better fit for some than others, that all students are going to skate by and we need to monitor them while they demonstrate their mastery, and that schools also need to be prompted and monitored. And so that's what accreditation is for. Doug?
Yeah, and on your third point, Mac, I would argue the other side of the coin, where that administrative burden that we were talking about is about a lot of times documenting the things that are being done at these institutions. Many of us, we all have a mission, which is what we're talking about here on this slide. And that is probably the most often referred to piece of documentation that you'll have in an accreditation document, an accreditation study. But stopping to write down everything that's going on and stopping to document all of the processes and the procedures and the things we're trying to do to serve students, knowing it from my roles as department chair and dean and chief academic officer, stopping to write it all down was what made us have the angst. We knew we were doing the things we needed to do to be compliant with a standard. We just didn't want to stop and write it all down.
It's not the doing of it, it's the documenting of it.
The documenting it. Right. So we all have a mission, right? But having a mission isn't always enough. And what we do know is that students come in unprepared. Many of them, not all of them, and they'll be unprepared in different ways, at different levels. And finding ways to serve these students is a challenge, particularly if we're looking at a community college or primarily a two-year college that is expected to be everything for everybody. Those institutions have perhaps even a heavier lift with students coming in that are not quite ready for college, be that in the traditional areas where we think of, or be that in some of those non-cognitive skills that Mac was just talking about. So we have tools and techniques and things we need to put in place to support those at-risk learners. And then ultimately, we need to tell that story. And we need to tell that story in a convincing way for accreditors. And we have to document all of the processes and pieces and parts that we have going on. So serving that population of students that may not quite be ready in an environment where money is very tight for the tools that we might need is a challenge. And then stopping to tell that story is also a challenge for institutions in this accreditation journey. Give us the next slide. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is that online student and the process of meeting that federal requirement. The federal requirement that we ensure the student completing the work is the one that is registered in the class, right? Every accreditor has this. They used to be regional accreditors, they're not, now they're institutional accreditors. The DOE stripped that regional name off of them a while back. But this is a federal requirement. Everybody requires that you have something in place to identify students and verify that the right student is doing the work. The minimum, of course, is unique username and password. That's the minimum. But is that enough, right? We're going to talk a little later in this presentation about academic integrity a little deeper, but I wrote a blog on this not too long ago and use the example of the fact that I log in with my wife's credentials all the time, with her permission, right? But I log in with her stuff all the time to check on insurance claims on the kids for health or whatever, whatever it is. So the next step, we look at doing things in a proctored environment, and some faculty on their own will require some proctoring. Some institutions have that as a requirement where there's at least one proctored exam or assignment or that kind of thing. Writing intensive courses can also kind of fit this bill, because you can kind of tell after a while if a student wrote that paper or if they pulled it off the internet, especially if you have some diagnostic work earlier in the semester. So when this doesn't work, when this falls down, what are the consequences of insufficient identity verification? And I would argue that the consequence is dilution. Dilution of student learning outcomes attainment data, dilution or a compromising of the integrity of the student achievement data. So you're looking at student learning outcomes, you assess them in a course with an assignment, and that happens to be something in an online class where maybe the student's skating the line or they're over the line from an integrity standpoint. Now you've got data that says everybody's achieved the standard, but maybe they didn't. Student achievement as well, as you move through an academic program, you guys all know this, you move away from memorize and regurgitate and into apply skills or apply knowledge in a novel environment. And sometimes that's the break where the student was able to kind of skate through and maybe get a little help that wasn't supposed to be there on those earlier memorize and regurgitate kind of things, but then they get to applying that knowledge and they can't do it. So then you're looking at student achievement measures like retention and persistence and completion and those types of things. And the performance starts dropping off as an institution.
Okay. Very well. So thank you there, Doug, for those thoughts about why learner authentication is important to the federal government. And I like to think about the reason why it's important to them is the golden rule. You know what that is, right? He who has the gold makes the rules. And in this case, the federal government has the gold, and they're giving out some of that gold to students to continue their education. And they really want to know that the people they're giving the gold to are the ones who are learning, right? And so along with that construct of learner authentication, there's different ways you can do it. Like I said, username and password. But one of the other ways you'll see when we look at the standard in just a moment is proctoring. So let's think a little bit about proctoring as a way not only to foster academic integrity, but it's also, you know, you're validating that it is the student who's taking the course that's also demonstrating mastery of their content. At SmarterServices here with our product, SmarterProctoring, we're passionate about the fact that proctoring should not be a one-size-fits-all endeavor. At many organizations that provide proctoring, they provide what's there over on the right side in that kind of pink purplish looking part of the Venn diagram of virtual proctoring. And virtual proctoring is awesome. You've got automated virtual proctoring, which uses artificial intelligence to look for anomalies. You've got record and review, which uses that same AI, but then a human comes along after it and looks at it. And then you've got live virtual proctoring, where you've got a trained professional online virtual proctor watching the student at all times. And those are great. And those three basic categories are what most other proctoring companies provide. But we see, as I'll justify in just a moment, that really you need to give students more choices than that. And that's why SmarterProctoring also offers face-to-face and hybrid modalities. On the face-to-face side, there are collegiate and professional testing centers, what we call proctoring professionals. That could be an HR director at a corporation, a pastor at a church, or someone, you know, that's pre-approved. Could also be the instructor as proctor. And then we have a third modality that we call hybrid virtual proctoring. And it really grew out of the pandemic. When all of the testing centers closed, you had all of these trained proctors sitting at home. They couldn't proctor anybody. And they said, wow, it'd be great if we had an online platform that allowed us to be proctoring while we're at home. Well, that's what hybrid virtual proctoring does. It did it during the pandemic, continues to do it now because many testing centers are seeing that it really can grow the scope of their service from beyond just how many people can come physically into their testing center, but they can have their own staff as the live virtual proctors who are doing the virtual proctoring for their students who are located wherever. So at SmarterProctoring, we're committed to providing more than just virtual proctoring. We believe that that really reduces the risk for the organization as well as makes the students happier. And both of those are good things, right? When you think about it, there are several categories of students that really don't prefer virtual proctoring. Those may be people that are just really kind of uncomfortable from a privacy standpoint of sharing their home environment, or it may be that they have several people living in their home. Right now, I've got a good internet connection in my house, but I asked my wife if she might run her errands during this webinar so that she wouldn't be, streaming and using her phone and other things that drag down the network. So for learners that have many people living in their household, virtual proctoring can present a challenge. Check out our blog. We've got several blogs posted about this and other issues. Another category of students for whom virtual proctoring is a special challenge are the neurodiverse students. Anyone feels a certain level of increased anxiety before they take a test, and that's normal, that's healthy. But for a neurodiverse person, the fact that they're being monitored electronically by a stranger that they can't see really ramps up their level of anxiety to a point that's parallel to what we might consider stage fright. And that really is not a fair environment to ask that person to demonstrate their mastery of the course topic. And so when a school is just locked into virtual proctoring and that's the only options they give, it really isn't fair for the neurodiverse learners. But on the other side of it, you've got some people, many people, for which virtual proctoring is awesome. And that's what they want. They don't want to have to go to campus and hire a babysitter and use their gas and take their time. So the fact is, everyone's use case is different, and proctoring does not need to be a one-size-fits-all situation. Nowhere was this highlighted better than a few months ago when Cleveland State University, a student filed suit against them, and you likely heard about this. The student said that the room scan violated their Fourth Amendment rights. And when it came down to the details of the case, it wasn't the fact that the room scan was done, but it was how it was done. The student had protested the room scan requirement. The requirement was removed from them, but that was never communicated to the faculty member who was the proctor. So the student was forced to undergo the room scan anyway. So the whole thing was just a problem. Well, the judge declared that the ruling in that case only applied to that one student, not even the other students in the course, not other students all over the country, but that decision is being appealed. So it's not over yet, so stay tuned with it. But many of our clients with Smarter Proctoring turned off that ability to, or that requirement to do a room scan, and that's fine. But really what that underscores is the fact that you can't do virtual proctoring just one way and it fit everyone, right? So giving your students options even provides more legal protection for your organization. And so by the face-to-face network that we provide, a recent count, there were 511 testing centers, over 2,300 face-to-face proctors. So there's someone or some location near most students that they can go to so that if virtual proctoring presents a technology or a privacy or an accommodation challenge for them, right there in the same place where they would sign up for virtual proctoring, right in the LMS, right in their course, they can schedule these other modalities as well. So let's think a bit more deeply about some of the issues around fostering academic integrity. If you don't think cheating's happening, get your head out of the sand because it's happening. It's changed. Back in the 40s, there was a study, and only about 20% of college students were estimated to be cheating. But then now it's somewhere between 75 and 98%. And that finding was really validated just a few years ago in 2015 by a study done by the International Center for Academic Integrity. And the number they settled on was that 95% of college students cheated in some form, right? And this was a longitudinal study done over 12 years, involved 70,000 students. Think about that number. That's a big number, right? 95% of students are being academically dishonest in some way. And the profile of the cheating student has changed. It used to be that struggling student that had to cheat to get by, but it's not that way now. It's the academically prepared students who are trying to keep that GPA up to keep their scholarship, or they're trying to keep their parents happy, or they're trying to stay in some social club, or whatever their motivation is, they're cheating for various reasons. And it no longer seems to carry the stigma that it once did. The grades, the end is really what's important to the student, not the learning that takes place along the way. And then this last bullet point here is what's really concerning. That study found that fewer college officials, and that included faculty members, only 35% of them believed that cheating was a problem. which was actually lower than the value for the general public, which was 41%. Why is that? Why did that research find that faculty weren't as concerned? Well, here's what I speculate. I feel like faculty members are concerned, but the administrative burden placed on them is overwhelming. So you take this guy here, I don't know who that is, that's stock art. He kind of looks like maybe an engineering professor. I don't know, he's got on a nice looking sweater there. Maybe he's a literature professor. Well, we'll not stereotype him anymore, but imagine he's some kind of professor, right? We'll go with biology. You know what he wants to do? He wants to teach biology, period. He doesn't want to do all these administrative things involved with proctoring. He doesn't want to spend his time watching videos of people sitting at their desk taking a test. He doesn't want to spend time helping students schedule for someone to be approved as their proctor. He doesn't want to have to remember the myriad of forms and spreadsheets and cover sheets that are all involved. And while he may be compassionate toward his students who need accommodations, it's that administrative workflow that's several stages long that's really a burden to that faculty member. And I think because of that is why so many faculty just say, hey, you know, we're not going to bother with this whole proctoring thing. But is that really what we need to do? Because I talked earlier about students and their mentality of getting by with as little as they can, and that how they really need to be able to demonstrate their mastery in an environment where it's valid. And so that's why proctoring is so important. We did some research recently where we surveyed students right after they had taken a proctored exam. And we asked them to rate and rank different proctoring modalities by the level of psychological deterrent. And when you look at this, the kind of the pinkish, purplish bar there on the left are the very strong deterrents. Or students said, proctoring in this modality is really going to prevent me from cheating or be more of a deterrent. So what was the strongest one? The approved human proctor. That's when you've got the student sitting there, same desk with, you know, their HR director or a pastor at a church or some other approved person. That's a pretty strong deterrent, right? Look what's after it. Instructor proctored. You know, we've got some instructors that do proctoring themselves, but it's not very many. But I think it's because of that administrative burden. But when you look at this, these are students telling us that that's the second highest category that's a strong psychological deterrent against cheating. And next would be almost tied are your corporate and collegiate testing centers, followed by a location such as a library. And then at the very bottom of the list are all the virtual proctoring categories. So if we really want to do a good job as an organization in fostering integrity, we need to provide a testing environment that they can demonstrate their competency in a way that adds validity to it. Then we need to monitor it. And we need to do that through proctoring, but we don't need to make them proctor all the same way. We need to give them choices of virtual, face-to-face, or hybrid. I want to tell you about one other resource that you may not be familiar with. It's the International Center for Academic Integrity. I mentioned them earlier in that longitudinal research about testing integrity. But, you know, at any university, there is a panel or a committee of people that when a student is suspected of cheating, that panel convenes and they look at the evidence, they hear the case, and they make a decision. Well, the ICAI is the professional organization of the people who sit on those panels. And so they get together at an annual conference. I've been to it twice. It's great. They talk about good practices. They talk about challenges. As an organization, they also conduct and publish research. So it's really a strong organization. I highly recommend them to you. If you're not familiar with them, check them out at academicintegrity.org. Okay, Doug?
So as we said at the beginning, this verification of student identity in an online course is a federal requirement. Every formerly known as regional accreditor has this in its library, if you will. This is the HLC version of it. It's actually not built into the standards itself. It's a kind of a separate federal requirements document that they've got. And this one does specifically call out, well, it's really small. It does specifically call out proctored examinations or other technologies or practices that are effective as an option. You know, the other accreditors, SAC-COC, it's 10.6. I want to say 10.6A, but it's really just 10.6. And it's not as prescriptive as this. It doesn't give you any options. It just says you have to verify the student's identity in an online course. MSCHE is the same way. In fact, they've got a new set of standards. I want to give a shout out to Carol from SmarterMeasure, who saw that there was a new set of, or an update to their accreditation standards that includes now within the standards, the identity verification, NECHE, Northwest, all of them have it. Well, I haven't found it in the Western Association. I know it's there because it's a federal requirement. So it's always there. And as we're talking about the administrative burden of accreditation, and we talk about the documentation of what you are doing, there's always a trade-off, right? A new tool, a new platform, a new something that you can use to either help students or to verify student identity or those types of things. All of that, of course, comes at a price. And the trade-off is, does it help us when it comes time to write a narrative? One, does it do what it's supposed to do, which is make sure students are as being as filled with integrity as possible? But the second question is this going to give us the kind of report that is plug and play for writing our accreditation narrative, to tell our story about how we go beyond the minimum of username and password within the idea of identifying our students for sure within our accreditation narratives.
Okay, very good. So let's kind of shift gears a little bit with the direction of the conversation. We've talked a lot now about learner authentication and testing integrity. Let's move more now toward fostering retention, because if we want to help these students, if we want to improve the lives of them and their families, guess what? They've got to stay enrolled. So how do we make sure that happens? And we all know that the pandemic hurt in a lot of ways. It changed our society fundamentally, and it's going to take years, if not decades, to get over that. And we're not out of the woods yet. But you look at this figure, this was back during the pandemic. This is November of 2020. 85% of students said, yeah, this pandemic is making it harder for me to learn. 71% of educators agreed, and they said, yeah, the pandemic is really hurting our students. And that showed up in retention rates dropping during the pandemic. Now, for all institutions, it was just about a 0.5 percentage point, but there are some types of institutions that it hurt more than others. At two-year institutions, the decline was 2%. But there's a segment of that population at two-year institutions that was really, really hurt. And those were the part-time students, right? It declined by 4%, which is a big percentage point. Well, you may be wondering, now that we're kind of moving out of the pandemic, is it getting better? Well, the most recent statistic I could find was from the National Student Clearinghouse, and this was put out last June, right? And so they reported that the persistence rate is getting better. We've seen growth, but we've yet to recover back to pre-pandemic levels. So our institutions are still suffering when it comes to student retention. Doug, I'll let you comment on this.
Sure. You know, a big part of retention is student readiness walking in the door. As we all know, it is easier to keep a student than it is to recruit a new one, especially as we run through this latest demographic transition, especially in some areas of our country where there are fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer even college-age students that the institutions are competing for. So keeping them is important, and helping them understand their readiness is a piece of that puzzle. So again, most students, especially those in community colleges, don't come in prepared. We look at them in terms of reading, writing, and math. Are they ready in reading, writing, and math? In fact, an interesting story here, back in the day, I was overseeing a transition from a print catalog to an online catalog, and happened to be editing a piece of the catalog while in a webinar about reading level, and pulled a very introductory, what I thought was a very basic paragraph out of that catalog and dropped it into the reading level measurement platform that you can find online, and found out that our introductory paragraph in our catalog was written at a master's plus level. It was an eye opener. We had some work to do. But these students that come in, they're not reading at even grade level. Most of them, the math skills aren't there. The writing skills aren't there. So we build these elaborate scaffolds around them. We have developmental coursework or remedial coursework, or we have co-requisite coursework within those college level gateways in Comp 1 and college algebra to help these students be successful. But what we typically don't look at is, are these students ready for every type of institutional learning environment that we give them, right? They're used to being in class, they're coming out of high school, they've been sitting in classes and having faculty talk to them and talk at them and talk with them for years, but maybe they're not used to that online environment. It is an attractive environment, it is a flexible environment, it is all of the things that some of these students need as they have competing priorities for time. Maybe they're an older student, they've got kids, they've got aging parents, they've got both. So we wanted to think about this in terms of two different things. Readiness for math, English, or math and English, math, writing, and reading, but readiness for online as well. And the diagram on the right just kind of talks about learner readiness and makes the case that everybody's kind of responsible for it. Student affairs, the student support narrative, every one of these accreditors has a student support narrative, and this is not one, or student support standard, and this is not one where institutions typically get in trouble. But everybody has to tell this story about how they support their students. We're talking about learning centers and tutoring and those types of things. We're also talking about food banks and connection to rent assistance and those types of things that students also need as well. All of that typically lives over in student affairs. Over in academic affairs, we're interested in placement. We're interested in those student success measures, the gateway course, the persistence, the retention, the completion, those measures that we put out there onto the web occasionally or are required to, depending upon where we are, to talk about what we're doing. We're talking student learning outcomes and the ability to attain those and report on those. So all of that factors into learner readiness, and taking a student who may or may not be ready in those three areas and dropping them into an online learning environment where they are definitely not ready is really a recipe to lose a student. So looking at online readiness is an important part of the placement standard. And I'm looking at my table on the other screen. MSCHE, HLC, Northeast, and Northwest all have a student placement standard within their principles of accreditation. So this is a story that some of you have to tell, and measuring online readiness is kind of a natural next step after math, writing, and reading.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Doug. My takeaway in looking at your graphic there is that this is an enterprise-wide, holistic activity, right? There's no one department that's responsible for this. It's a rising tide floats all boats, right? And before we move on, I looked at our questions and answers. Several people were asking, just to clarify, as we stated in the beginning, we will be providing a recording of this webinar. As Doug just mentioned about a table that he's looking at, you'll receive a couple of emails from us. The second of those will contain some resources that may include that table and some other things. So just be looking for those emails from us with the recording and the survey after the webinar today. And keep posting your questions there. Carol is responding to you, and we'll address them at the end. So if this construct of learner readiness is an enterprise-wide, holistic endeavor, so many people are involved with it, how can we bring to bear a certain data set on that? And the data set I'm thinking about is non-cognitive data. Now, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they want to serve lots of the world's problems, right? One of those problems that they're concerned about is this fact. Well, first of all, they know what I said in the outset, that higher education is great at breaking the cycle of poverty. But they also see that many people understand that, they catch that vision, they enroll in college, but then they soon drop out. And now they've got a student loan that they have no greater ability to repay, and they're really in worse shape than they were at the beginning. So the Gates Foundation wanted to understand, why does this happen so frequently? And so they collected data that's really difficult for our institutions to collect, because once a student drops out, they don't fill out your surveys anymore, right? But the Gates Foundation, through their reach, surveyed tens of thousands of people all over the country and said, hey, why did you start college and then drop out? And then look at their reasons. Conflicts with work schedule, affordability, lack of support from family, could be financial or practical, just didn't believe the degree was valuable, or they partied out, right? But when you think about all of those are non-cognitive reasons. Education Advisory Board recently did a survey where they asked a similar question to a different population. They asked people who had shown interest in enrolling at a university but never did enroll. And they said, what were the barriers? What kept you out? And again, look at the non-cognitive factors: cost, family responsibilities, professional work-related commitments. And then finally, NC State University, this was 6,000 two-year college students. And they said, while you're enrolled, what are the challenges? And again, it's the non-cognitive stuff that it's at the top: the work, the expenses, the family and the friends. Then when you get toward the bottom is where doing college level work comes in. So while what Doug is talking about with the math and the writing and all that's very important, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that in our assessment in a moment. If it's true that non-cognitive factors are the reasons why a lot of students don't enroll, they're the frustrations they experience while they're enrolled, and they're the straw that breaks the camel's back that makes them drop out, then doesn't that stand to reason that we need to be measuring and responding to non-cognitive factors? What do I mean by non-cognitive? Again, it's words like this on the screen. You may think of it under the umbrella title of soft skills, right? So measuring these soft skills is important, but what's more important than just measuring it is taking action on the data. And that's what I'm going to show you about a tool that really helps you take action on the data. And that tool is an assessment that we have been providing it for a long time, 21 years now. That's the SmarterMeasure Learning Readiness Indicator. It is the most widely used assessment that quantifies non-cognitive readiness for learning. It's been around since 2002, been taken by over 6 million students. What do we measure on that assessment? Well, we start out looking at the student internally. We call this individual attributes. These are things like motivation, control over procrastination, willingness to ask for help, locus of control, things that kind of define that learner's learning personality. While we're looking at that learner internally, we also identify their dominant learning style. It's based on the multiple intelligences model. So that's whether they're visual, verbal, social, solitary, those things. Next, we look at the student externally. We call that one life factors. That's their availability of time, support from family, support from employers, having an appropriate place to study, their general health, finances. It's really an environmental scan of what's happening in their life. All these things impact the student's experience as a student. We also measure their skill set. We look at their on-screen reading rate and recall, their technical competency, their confidence with the learning management system, their keyboarding rate and accuracy. So all of those are the non-cognitive data set that we're collecting. Now, in that same interface, while we collect the non-cognitive data, over time, so many schools said, hey, we like your assessment, we love your assessment engine, we'd like to be able to also measure cognitive abilities, specifically math and writing, which is what Doug mentioned. So we also have a math readiness indicator and a writing readiness indicator. These are not designed to be as diagnostic or prescriptive as, say, an Accuplacer. They're both 30-item instruments that pull from a pool of 90 items, but schools use these to identify students that may need additional assessment or placement intermediation courses or something like that. How do schools use this assessment? Lots of different ways. As an optic, a lens to allow that student to be self-enlightened about their own strengths and opportunities. It's a great student service that students see that, hey, my school is interested in helping me be successful. As I mentioned, some schools use it for placement in developmental or remedial courses. It's a super strong talking point for academic advisor. I mean, imagine you're an academic advisor and a student comes to you at the end of the first week of class, and guess what? They failed their first test. What are you going to say to that student? Hey, buddy, hang in there and let's do better next week. Well, that's encouraging, but it's not really developmental. When that advisor is equipped with this data set about all of these non-cognitive traits and attributes and skills, they've got a rich data set that they can talk to that student about and ways that they can coach that student to actually have different strategies the next week. This data is certainly an early alert. Many schools even give this assessment before the student takes their first course. So you don't have to allow the student to fail before you intervene. You can intervene based on these traits before they even get started. And then finally, we've done research with so many institutions that this data is truly predictive as an analytic of retention, satisfaction, and success. Where do schools position the assessment? Lots of different ways. There's no right and wrong way. You don't even have to put it just in one way. You can put it in multiple. But we've seen it everywhere from in the recruitment process, in the admissions process as one of several assessments students take. Some people put it in the registration, that before you register for an online course, so to speak, you've got to take this assessment. Orientation is probably the most common place where schools put it. Many schools equip their academic advisors with it so that they can administer it to students as needed. We've seen it in first year experience programs, quality enhancement plans, as well as, just regular academic courses. So Doug, I'll hand it back over to you.
Excellent. So our post-secondary institutions have been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion long before DEI was cool, right? Now it is becoming cool, and we hear these terms all the time. And what I've pulled out of again, I default back to calling them regionals, and I apologize, but what I pulled out of the regional institutions are various quotes about DEI and the requirements of telling your story through that lens where it's appropriate, based on your student body, based on the ways that you might disaggregate that. And the non-cognitive skills that we're talking about here as part of the online readiness puzzle they're not universal, right? You will see them popping into some populations more than others within your student body. And all of the accreditors require that you tell at least part of your accreditation story through the lens of DEI. One of the common questions that I get, I live in Central Florida, and one of the common questions I get when I'm speaking with potential clients is, well, what is going on with higher education in Florida? We don't have time for that conversation in this webinar. But I actually find it interesting that SAC-COC has the least pervasive, I guess pervasive is the wrong word, there's a negative context there. Let's call it the least amount of penetration across all of their standards for that DEI flavor. The others have it much more prominently placed. So telling that story of student placement, student readiness, student support is important to incorporate a flavor of DEI in that. And one of my first questions, Mac, you can back me up here. One of my first questions about this is, can we get a report out of the learner readiness tool that can be disaggregated easily by either ethnic group or by socioeconomic status, which typically is Pell eligibility or not. And they indicated that yes, that was available. So that piece, that DEI piece, it's important to think about when you're looking at a tool like this or something else to help support a function that you have. Is to make sure that it can give you the data that you need. I don't know how many times in my career when I was on campus, we would get a hold of a new a new platform or a new support piece, and of course the salesman tell you it can do whatever you want it to do until you ask it to do something, and oh no, we can't do it that way. So I wanted to make sure that this is the tool that excites me the most. And I tell you why it excites me the most. It's not that identity verification is not important. It's that that's one of the easiest things to do as an institution in an accreditation self-study, is to show that you have a unique username and password for students. But in this case, this is what really excited me. One of my other first questions was, wow, we could do this for a QEP. They're like, oh yeah, we've done that. So SAC COC institutions, this would be a fantastic QEP idea to look at learner readiness. And again, you can pull in that DEI flavor. One last tidbit I want to give you about DEI before we go on. I said that SAC COC currently is the least, has the least penetration of DEI through all of the standards. There are some proposed changes to the principles of accreditation for SAC COC that will be voted on in December that would drastically change that. So just be aware if you are a SAC COC institution. Right, and then I think we got one more slide, and then Carol has indicated we've got somebody with a question. So let me run through this real quick. So learner readiness, again, I indicated that many of the institutional accreditors have that learner readiness student placement kind of a standard. This one is from Middle States. And you can see it's over there on Part B, a process by which students who are not adequately prepared for study, have been admitted, are identified, supported. This is one of the ways to identify and support in that online environment, to be able to serve those students, and in particular, to tell that story, again, potentially through that DEI lens. How can we get to that question, Carol?
Dave, if you want to put that question in Q&A, or I can unmute you. Either one's fine.
Yeah, while we're rounding that up, I'll just make one comment. Doug there referenced online, and that's kind of a term we use interchangeably. While the SmarterMeasure assessment did have its genesis with online learning. In fact, the very first name of it was an acronym, READY. It stood for Readiness for Education at a Distance Indicator. And at first, that's all we were measuring was online learning readiness. And after we had done that for about a decade, many schools said, hey, you know what? The same traits and attributes and skills that apply to online learners really apply to all learners. And so that's when we changed the name of the assessment to SmarterMeasure, Learning Readiness Indicator. And at that point, also the text of the assessment and the student output was edited. So no longer was it specific to just online learning. So while the first version may have said something like, as you're taking an online course, now it would just say, as you're continuing your education. So the assessment itself applies across all different learning modalities. And then that was a good thing, because then the pandemic came along, and guess what? The line was very blurred between face-to-face classes and online classes, because face-to-face classes were now online. And so now you've got a hybridization of that continues at so many organizations, even classes that predominantly meet face-to-face, utilize the learning management system in a very strong way. And so forgive us when out of habit, I may talk about online learner readiness. I'm really meaning learner readiness as they're using online resources, right? So it's not just one delivery system that we're speaking of. We'll move ahead to the slides about our organizations, Doug, and then Carol may have that question for us.
All right, sounds good. Again, I appreciate all of you able to join us today and listen in. Southeastern Accreditation Consultants is kind of a brainchild I put together right as the pandemic was making everything fall apart. It seemed like the time was right. So 2020, we put this into place following, if you remember from the very beginning of the presentation, Mac claimed 3 decades of experience in higher ed. So if you can do some math, you'll know that he's older than I am. But launching this enterprise followed 20 years in higher ed, taught at a small regional institution in Alabama, served as department chair, dean, chief academic officer, as well as a faculty member for 10 years before that. As a company, we've got a proven track record. We've served all sorts of institutions, from small community colleges to larger 4-year institutions to institutions that offer graduate degrees as well. So we have a variety of experience and successful experience. And then innovative strategies. All through my time on campus, I was part of the SAC COC puzzle. I served on committees. I chaired committees, attended that annual meeting every year, it seemed like, except for one. My provost let me off the hook the year my son was born. So seen a lot of the strategies, have worked with institutions on strategic planning as well, and making sure that gets integrated in, because having that as a living, breathing piece of the fabric of what you do, at least for within the SAC COC principles, writes about 4 standards for you. If that's built together and fully integrated into what you're doing, rather than something you put on the shelf as soon as you're done with it. So a lot of good stuff going on, and it's, what, I'm just an accreditation nerd. I'll completely own that. I have been an accreditation nerd since the very beginning, and was doing other things while still developing my nerddom along the way. But now this is all I do, and I'd love to have a conversation with any of you about how we might be able to work together.
So Doug, that's great that your nerddom grew out of your professional experiences. I'm in the same hat. I'm an e-learning nerd, and the services that SmarterServices provide grew out of that experience. Like you, I've got a long history in higher ed institutions. I served as a dean of distance learning at 2 different institutions. I had a 3-year stint in a department of institutional effectiveness. I worked in a college of education as a director of instruction design and technology. And it's really out of all of those experiences in higher ed where I saw the need for these 2 tools about learner readiness and learner integrity. They're just so important. And so, Doug and I both are academics that have gone over to the dark side working on the corporate world. But I hope what you hear us saying is that we still consider ourselves academics, and we're passionate about these services that our organizations are providing, because we want to be able to provide that to multiple institutions and really help multiple students. And so, I just encourage you, as you guys are shopping for different services, when you find an organization that's led by an academic, they're going to get it, right? And so that's really, we have the same genesis. Been around since 2002, served over 1,000 institutions, proctored millions of exams, and given millions of students SmarterMeasure. Our 2 services are SmarterMeasure and SmarterProctoring that we talked about. There is our contact information by email. We'd love to continue the conversation with you afterwards. So I'll pause now. And Carol, do you have any questions we need to address?
I don't have anything that's showing in chat right now. I did have someone raise their hand, but I didn't have a question put in chat afterwards. So if anybody have any questions that you want to ask right now before we wrap up, feel free to type those in the Q&A at the bottom.
So are you guys seeing my poll results now?
I'm not.
Do you see that on my screen share? No?
Nope.
I'm still struggling with how to do this in Zoom. I drug it on top of the screen that I was sharing.
Well, there it goes. Yep,
There it is.
I was going to say it's probably my fault, because I've had nothing but technology problems for 48 hours.
So this was back to your pre-webinar poll, and you'll see there that 52% say the administrative burden it's too heavy, but look at there, there's 38% say it's just about right. And that really, man, I'm glad to hear that you recognize that while it is a task, it's a worthwhile task. It's a task that helps your organization be responsible and to demonstrate and document the good practices that you all already have in place. So thank you guys for your time. We're going to give you 4 minutes back on your day. So feel free to travel or whatever you'd like to do with that extra time. And we'll send you an email to follow up. Thank you.